Mr. President, last week I came down to the Senate floor to talk about the need for tax reform. One of the most important things that we can do to help our economy and American families recover from years of economic stagnation under the previous administration is to reform our tax code. The tax code affects every aspect of our economy. It affects how much money you have left over to save or to invest. It affects whether or not a new business can get off the ground. It affects whether or not an existing business might have the money to raise wages or to hire new employees. And it's often the determining factor in whether or not American jobs go overseas. Right now, our tax code isn't doing much to help anybody. It affects how much money you have. I should say it's increasingly strangling our economy, depressing job and wage growth, and discouraging new business creation and pushing American jobs overseas. And it's placing a heavy burden on working families who see far too much of their paychecks going to Washington, D.C. And that's why Republicans, Mr. President, are making tax reform a priority this fall, and we're hoping that Democrats will join us. Last week I mentioned the 5 principles that will guide any Republican tax reform legislation. Any bill that we pass will have to do these things. 1, result in increased wages, jobs, and economic growth. 2, provide tax relief for the middle class. 3, keep good-paying jobs here at home. 4, increase American competitiveness in the global economy. And finally, Mr. President, it has to simplify the tax code. Now, last week I spent some time discussing the first principle, which is increasing wages, jobs, and economic growth. This week I'd like to take just a few minutes to focus on the second, and that's providing tax relief for the middle class. Hard-working Americans have had a hard time of it in recent years. Wage growth was almost non-existent during the Obama administration. A recent survey found that 50% of people in this country consider themselves to be living paycheck to paycheck. Families who once looked forward to a secure future have found themselves wondering where the next mortgage or rent payment is coming from, or if they'll be able to afford to put anything toward their kids' college savings or toward their retirement. Fortunately, there are a lot of tax relief measures that we can take that will help middle-income families. And any plan for relief has to start with lowering tax rates for the middle class. The federal government is simply taking too much money each month from working families. And Mr. President, we need to fix that. American families can do a much better job spending their money than Washington bureaucrats. And any new tax bill needs to leave more money in Americans' wallets, money that they can put toward their family's needs, from paying for a child's braces to saving for college. Relief for American families starts with lowering tax rates, Mr. President, but it doesn't end there. There are other things that we can do to help hardworking families. Closing loopholes and ending a variety of special interest tax breaks will boost our efforts to significantly lower rates. And simplifying family-focused provisions of the tax code will make them easier for families to access. We need to look at provisions like the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child Tax Credit to make sure they are delivering the tax relief that Congress intended, and to look for ways to make them more efficient and effective. Education tax benefits are another example of an area where tax reform can deliver for middle-income families. Currently, there are more than a dozen separate tax provisions relating to education, from the American Opportunity Tax Credit to 529 savings accounts. And of course, these provisions come with approximately 100 pages of IRS instructions, special forms, schedules, not to mention the professional tax preparer that too many families have to hire to figure it all out. We can certainly do a better job than that. Simplifying and possibly consolidating the education provisions of the tax code could allow more families to take advantage of these provisions and significantly reduce the time that families have to spend trying to obtain these benefits. Another thing that we can do is make sure that the tax code encourages savings and investment. We'll be taking a look at the tax treatment of retirement savings to ensure that it maximizes individuals' ability to achieve a secure retirement. Another thing that we need to do is finally do away with the alternative minimum tax. This tax, which was originally designed to hit the very wealthiest Americans, eventually ballooned to ensnare huge numbers of the middle class. Now, while Congress has partially fixed this problem, too many families still have to waste time calculating their taxes twice, once for their regular return and once to see if they have to pay the alternative minimum tax. Now imagine the frustration of having to do this extra calculation only to find out that you don't owe the alternative minimum tax. But if you don't spend the time or hire a professional to figure it out and decide to take your chances, you'll certainly hear about it from the IRS if you guess wrong, usually with penalties and interest. While Congress has acted to protect a lot of middle-income taxpayers, there are still middle-class families who find themselves having to pay the alternative minimum tax. It's time to eliminate this tax, which has long outlived its original purpose. Mr. President, there are a lot of other things that we can do to make the tax code better for middle-class families. And throughout this process, Republicans are going to make sure that hardworking Americans are at the forefront of our efforts. We know that American families do the best job of spending their own money, and any tax reform bill we pass will allow them to keep more of their hard-earned dollars. Mr. President, before I close, I'd just like to spend a couple of minutes talking about the National Defense Authorization Act, which we'll be considering here this week. Our military often got the short end of the stick during the Obama administration, and we have a lot of work to do to bring our military back to full readiness and to modernize our resources. Recent events, from the increased aggression of the North Korean regime to the anniversary of September 11th, remind us of the importance of making sure that our military is ready to meet any threat. A key element of keeping the peace is making sure that we have the military strength to deter aggressors. Take North Korea. Our main focus needs to be on a diplomatic resolution to growing tensions in the region. But as the President has made clear, the full strength of the U.S. military is and has to be at the ready to protect American interests and those of our allies. The Air Force has conducted show-of-force exercises, which have featured B-1 bombers from South Dakota to deter North Korea aggression. And while we continue with our diplomatic efforts, we need to make sure that we project the kind of overwhelming strength that would make North Korea think twice before trying to engage the United States. And needless to say, we also need to maintain robust capabilities on the defensive side. And that's why I've introduced an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act to require that we test our ground-based mid-course defense anti-ballistic missile system twice a year. Yes, tests may fail, but an increased test pace will lead to improvements and ultimately ensure the reliability of our missile interception defenses. Mr. President, in addition to North Korea, we're still dealing with continued threats and instability in the Middle East. U.S.-led efforts against ISIS have had significant success on the ground, especially in Iraq, but ISIS recruitment network remains active and ever more dangerous, as evidenced by attacks in Europe. There are also still complex security challenges on the ground in Syria and Afghanistan, and we're continuing to deal with an Iran that has grown more defiant in the wake of President Obama's nuclear deal. On top of all this, Russia and China continue to take advantage of regional instability to project power and challenge the U.S. and its allies. Russia continues to occupy Ukraine and challenge NATO and has propped up the Assad regime in Syria. Meanwhile, China is only half-heartedly working to keep North Korea in check, all the while expanding its presence in the Pacific by militarizing reefs in disputed waters and building up its forces. All of these threats underscore the importance of restoring our military readiness and modernizing our capabilities. And this year's National Defense Authorization Act takes significant steps toward achieving those goals. This bill sets policy and authorizes significant resources that will work to strengthen our military readiness. And that includes critical funds for combat aircraft and munitions, new ships, and advanced technology development and next-generation capabilities to ensure that our military is the strongest fighting force in the world. That also includes critical funding to boost the end strength of the Army and the Marine Corps. This bill also authorizes the 2.1% across-the-board pay raise for the dedicated men and women of our military. And the bill contains a number of measures to improve quality of life for soldiers and their families and Department of Defense civilian employees. This legislation also ends troubled and redundant programs and reduces unnecessary expenditures to ensure that taxpayer dollars are not being wasted and to free up funding for military priorities. Mr. President, I've introduced two other amendments to this bill to help further boost readiness. The first of these amendments seeks to optimize special use airspaces for our military pilots. My amendment would require a report on management of special use airspaces and their use for training, with the goal of improving coordination and utilization of these airspaces to meet current and future training needs. Additionally, to better position the U.S. to meet ever-changing cyber threats, I've introduced an amendment to establish a pilot program for a cyber ROTC. With the President elevating cybercom to a combatant command, it is essential that the Department of Defense establish additional pipelines to train more men and women in uniform to counter the mounting cyber attacks that we're facing. Mr. President, I'm grateful to Senator McCain and other senators on the Armed Services Committee for their work on this bill. It's an important step forward in making sure that our nation is secure and capable of meeting and deterring threats. Mr. President, I yield the floor.